Hello, and welcome to today's webcast, How Windows Virtual Desktop is Helping Organizations Adjust to a Changing Global Climate, brought to you by the Insight Microsoft Commercial Team. I'm Blair Loveland, your Microsoft Readiness Specialist at Insight, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. This webcast is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. The webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized. One slide, please. Can be completely customized. You can resize any of the screens or move any of the windows that you have open. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. All questions from this webcast will be captured, and there will be a Q&A during the last few minutes of the presentation. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the question mark icon below the presentation window. This guide helps cover common technical issues. I would now like to turn this over to our presenters, John Pontius and Charlie Balmer. John and Charlie, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. So very nice. Thanks, everybody, for coming. My name is John Pontius. I am a manager for our Microsoft pre-sale services practice here at Insight. So I have a team of specialists and experts designed to help your organizations understand new technologies, features, and functionality from Microsoft, and where specifically around cloud solutions, and where Insight can assist on your cloud journey. I'm joined today by two of my architects, who you'll hear from, Charlie Balmer and Jeff Langford. And today we're here to talk to you about Windows Virtual Desktop and how Windows Virtual Desktop is helping organizations solve real challenges in a time of global change and global pandemic. Blair, are you able to see the slides that I'm presenting?
I am, yes.
Okay, wonderful. So today we want to talk about a couple of things. We want to talk about what's prompting the move to Cloud VDI and Windows Virtual Desktop. So what are some of the things that we're seeing out in the market that are causing organizations to look at cloud-based desktop solutions? We're going to talk about what Windows Virtual Desktop is and why Windows Virtual Desktop is the best cloud-hosted Windows 10 ready platform for your organization to start hosting your desktops and applications in the cloud. We're going to talk a little bit about how Insight can help on that cloud journey and where Insight services offerings can help take your organization from either a nascent or non-existent Windows Virtual Desktop implementation all the way to full cloud operationalization. And then finally, we're going to have a little bit of a Q&A where you can ask questions to our experts around Windows Virtual Desktop. So what is prompting the move to Cloud VDI and Windows Virtual Desktop? Well, obviously, and everybody here knows that I don't need to hammer on it, but COVID-19 and the global pandemic have changed the game. 88% of organizations since the pandemic began have encouraged or required employees to work from home. 31% of those organizations say that COVID-19 was the trigger to begin allowing remote work. And 74% of companies plan to permanently shift to remote work post-COVID. So what we're seeing, and what you're probably seeing in your organizations as well, is a rapid acceleration in the amount of work we are expecting or requiring our employees to do remotely. We're seeing that that amount has been driven and again accelerated by COVID-19. And we're seeing that this is not something that is likely to stop. Even, hopefully we find a cure and we get past the current situation. But most organizations are saying that the remote workforce, the work from home workforce, is here to stay. But that comes with its own set of challenges. So that remote workforce is not without infrastructure security challenges for organizations. 54% of leaders have indicated that poor technology and or infrastructure is the biggest barrier to remote work. 42% report that at least half of their work from home employees suffer consistently poor experience. And 71% of executives are worried about business continuity, security, and productivity. So we want to allow our employees to work from home. Right now, we need to allow our employees to work from home. But when we've done that, especially considering the rapid pace that we've had to adopt and innovate these solutions, we found glaring deficiencies or inefficiencies in our existing infrastructure, in the way our employees are accessing applications and data. We're finding that it's actually leading to poor performance and potentially less productivity for our remote from home workers. And we're worried that in the next crisis, these will present themselves again. We won't have the right business continuity plans in place. We're worried that what we've had to do to expose our applications and data remotely to our employee has compromised potentially the security of our organization. And we're worried that even though 74% of organizations want employees to continue remote work beyond this pandemic, we're worried that the remote work that we're enabling is not necessarily as productive as the work that we could enable within the office. And Windows Virtual Desktops help solve all these challenges. So I'm going to hand this over to Charlie Balmer to get into the nuts and bolts of Windows Virtual Desktop and talk about how WVD can help solve these problems. Charlie?
So thanks, John. And as John mentioned, thank you, everybody, for attending this morning. We know during a busy time of the COVID that folks have become a little more accustomed to being online and being in these types of activities. So we welcome you to joining our webcast today. So typically when we start having these conversations around desktops and Windows Virtual Desktop as a whole, customers are coming to us and they're asking, how can we solve these problems and these challenges that have been coming up to us, and how do we make our environments better? So in today's constantly changing technology landscape, the key challenges revolve around security, protecting intellectual property, managing the operating system and software updates, and in the fastest expanding area, the growing remote workforce. And I would venture to say if everyone looked back even a year ago, maybe, but typically if you happen to have ever, looked at a job interview 5 years ago or did a performance review, in the last couple of years and had a boss or an interviewer say, where do you picture yourself in 5 years? I can certainly suspect that most folks did not anticipate themselves looking at today and saying, well, in 2020, I anticipated having 95% of my workforce working from home and most of my infrastructure being overwhelmed by everything that was going to happen as a result of where COVID took us. But we are where we are today, and so we've had some significant changes in how we approach the strategy in which we deliver these types of solutions. And so WVD has really stepped forward into the forefront of all of our minds. Excuse me. So this slide in these 4 key areas, I happen to love this slide because literally it could go in front of almost any one of the types of presentations that I often get an opportunity to speak to, whether it's security or information protection or Office 365, Azure ATP, Defender ATP, all of these areas are and should be at the forefront of every IT managers or directors' minds. Today, we're going to focus obviously on the desktop side of the house, and these 4 areas have been, kind of key for we'll say that desktop image management and application management type of delivery administrators' minds for quite some time. And so these are key things that have been woven into WVD from the very beginning. So the evolution of that endpoint management, and I'll reveal my age a little bit and say that I've been in the industry for 30 plus years, and I've been in endpoint management as well as infrastructure management for most of that time. So I've seen the evolution of SMS. I was literally part of the very, very old Windows NT 3.5.1 rollouts when they very first came about. So I've seen that evolution of how image management has come to be and how that's evolved over time. And eventually we got to learn and grow from our experiences. We've gone through that. And so we evolved from just pure desktop images into a point where we could do a little bit of automation. We could include applications in there. We could do things like dynamically start to add applications into how those images got deployed. And eventually we started to learn that server-based applications could be a part of that. And so we started to see RDS type remote desktop service type implementations. We started to see Citrix come onto into the virtualization world, and then ultimately virtual desktop infrastructure. And so as all of these started to come to fruition, we started to see greater security challenges, a lot of IT management overhead. Now desktop image management was no longer just how do I manage an image for my HP or Lenovo or Dell desktop, but now I had to manage it for my virtualized infrastructure as well. And so where were companies going to take all this? And so it really started to become a challenge for most enterprise, even for small business infrastructures, as far as how they were going to manage this. And so when we started to see this COVID stuff come into play, and even I'll say for a good year prior to that, people were really looking at what was going to be that next way to be able to offload some of this administrative overhead and really start to take advantage of some of the ways that they can make this type of task become something that was going to be a lower cost, and it would be something that could make the overall experience for their enterprises a little more manageable going forward. Because as we looked at some of the technologies that that were out there, when you looked at some of the Citrixes, some of the VMware workstations and Horizons, the Red Hat enterprise virtualizations, the Parallels remote workstations, all those came with an overhead, both from an infrastructure and an administrative perspective, that just were a lot to handle. So, granted, I know there's probably a mixture of folks that are attending the presentation today. So, I'm sure you're probably familiar with the VMwares, the Citrix, the Parallels, remote desktops, as I mentioned. And so I know that all of you aren't going to be familiar with the terms that are on here, or there might be some of you that are unfortunately painfully aware of all of the terms that are on here, and know that there's a significant infrastructure and cost and administrative overhead that go along with being able to maintain some of these. And so as we look at some of the cost and the licensing models that go along with that traditional VDI, it can become painfully expensive to implement some of this technology, because not only do you create an image to be able to present out to your end users, but you're also maintaining your gateways, your connection brokers, and you have to manage and deploy those licenses and pay for all the infrastructure that goes along with that, in addition to also paying for the Windows licensing, the server licensing. If you're paying, if you've got Citrix or Horizon, you're paying for those licenses in addition to that. And so all of that cost starts to add up. And then in addition to that, you typically have at least a dedicated VDI person, if not an entire team, to manage all of the components that go along with that. And so ultimately for IT managers, that becomes a huge and painful, in some cases, scenario to be able to maintain within your environment. So that's something that becomes, it's a highlight for IT managers, and it's something that they want to be able to consider a way to get past that as they look forward into what's kind of next. So what do they look for? Windows Virtual Desktop. It's a kind of a corny way to say what's next in the world, but Microsoft has traditionally, and for those of you that have been in the industry for a while, Microsoft tends to take that approach of they might see another innovator that takes some of those first steps into the water, test out how technology might work, and then they will look at some of the where some of the other performers have made their mistakes, where they've had some success, and then they will take their tried and true technology and strategy and processes and apply that on top of that to create a overall really awesome solution. And in the case of what they've done with their WVD implementation, that's exactly what they've brought to the table. So they've taken, what's already been in place around, really strategic approaches to imaging. And if you look at, literally the tens, if not, potentially hundreds of thousands of folks that are out there that have the experience around, imaging in the traditional SCCM or Microsoft Deployment Toolkit strategies and application layering that have gone along with, Windows 7 and then Windows 10 type scenarios. And they've incorporated all of the lessons learned around that to create essentially a desktop as a service solution, and incorporated that into how they would roll out this WVD strategy. And as they've done that, they've incorporated that into the Azure platform, so that as you roll that out, you get some of the key things that folks are already already leveraging in their Office 365, in their Azure environments, so that you get some of the out-of-the-box components like multi-factor authentication or conditional access that are natively built into Azure. Those are things that are natively accessible to the WVD platform as they get implemented. So for WVD, the key things that Microsoft wanted to really pull out into the forefront was, how do we make this a better solution that is really going to be advantageous and efficient, and is going to be something that our customers are really going to be able to leverage. So while I could dig truly deeply into the technical underpinnings of it, I'll keep it a little bit high level and talk mostly to the things that are going to be of the biggest concerns for the folks that are on the call today. So the two most important things that I think folks are going to want to know first is that it addresses the two things most near and dear to every IT manager's heart, and that is the management aspect of this and the cost. So while there is always going to be cost associated with almost everything in the Microsoft space, the focus of the Microsoft WVD cost model is not in the back-end infrastructure. It's really focused on the host pool section in the front, so that compute model that's there. And they allow you to really section this out so that if you have light users, so basically folks that are just accessing email, you can create a very light use scenario that allows you to address those users that just don't require a lot of compute power. But maybe you've got some heavier use engineering users, or maybe the kind of the middle tier that maybe use Excel a lot, or Word or Access, that maybe don't use everything that might be required of a CAD user or an engineering or power user type person, but do need the compute power. So you have the ability to be able to segment those out and appropriately provision that type of level based on the requirements for the applications that are going to be used for the individuals that are there. The second piece of that is that they really wanted to lift off the administrative and the costs that would go behind it. So while you look at a VMware or a Citrix type scenario where you've got to look at licensing all of those subcomponents that are behind the scenes, Microsoft takes all of that off the table. So there's, again, while there still is the cost for the virtualized guest operating system on the front side of it, they've taken away all of the gateway, all the connection broker components, all the licensing server components in the background, all the session hosts, all those pieces get removed from the equation so that you're not getting those, added fees. I know you see all those cellular commercials, now coming out that you get your bill and then you get all the added fees added into that. That's kind of Microsoft's mentality, is they didn't want you to have all those extra little things that are piled on as part of this. They wanted you to have one key component that would be delivered upon this. So they wanted it to be simple, and they wanted it to be very easily deliverable. So there's a lot of automation. So for those of you that are already, comfortable with PowerShell, those types of interfaces and administrative capabilities are natively in the platform to be able to make those kind of things very easily deployable. So one of the things I do want to call out, though, is that in a more realistic world, while it might be great to stop on a solution that's just based on cost and ease of management, if the consumers of the technology, those end users that are out there, have a poor user experience, or even if the perception of it is that it's not a good experience, they will ultimately consider that a failure. So one of the key pieces, or at least I would say from most users, and certainly from my perception, one of the key pieces of what WVD brings to the table that's unique to all of the VDI experiences that are out there is the inclusion of the FS Logics into Microsoft's WVD overall offering. The FS Logics is a virtualization component that elevates the non-persistent Windows virtual environment in both public and private clouds. So this can not only be in the WVD world, but this is a technology that can be brought on premise into private clouds as well. Today we'll talk about it specifically in the WVD space, but essentially it's presenting three primary core areas of technology to the WVD space. And those areas are the containers, the application masking, and the Java version control. And so what FS Logic does is it essentially creates a container of the technology. So the most prominent one that's in use is the profile on Office 365 containers. And so I'll highlight that today just as an example of where that takes the user experience and brings it to an entirely different level for users as they are logging into the environment. So for those of you that are familiar with user profiles, that stores essentially all of your user settings. Excuse me, on a local machine, it also includes things like your documents. It has all of your application content. If you're caching your Exchange, all your email offline, all those things are contained within the user profiles. And so when you log into even an on-premise VDI environment, that becomes kind of a mishmash of where that content is, especially if you have that, that C-level executive that has 20 gigs of data that's stored in their email box. That's all data that's stored within their user profile. And so having that be mobile becomes a very kludgy approach to being, to having a user experience that's very agile for them, that isn't being, that doesn't create an impactful in a negative perception way for that user experience. So what FS Logic does is it allows you to encapsulate that entire user profile essentially within a virtual hard disk. And so that VHDX environment, that container, gets stored within Azure. And so as a user logs into Windows Virtual Desktop, on the fly, essentially instantaneously, it gets attached to that user session, and that user profile is directly accessible for the user to be able to be using that. So that makes it awesome for things like OneDrive, for the Outlook OST, that Exchange cache mode configuration, user profiles, any application that has user-centric data. As soon as they log in, that content is directly available. For those of you that have the horrible Java scenario of multiple versions of Java that's scattered throughout your organization, you can do the same thing with Java. So you can have multiple versions of Java that are containerized, and you can attach and detach them on the fly, so that you can, if you have multiple versions of an application that use different versions of Java, then you can attach those on the fly. And finally, using the same container type approach, you can also containerize applications. So applications can be attached and detached from a Windows Virtual Desktop session without any installation. So what this means is a bulky application, and I like use AutoCAD as an example, because if you've ever installed AutoCAD, it's about 3 gigs in size. It takes at least 30 minutes to do the install. However, you can take AutoCAD, pre-install it into a container, and then as the user logs in, it can be attached to their WVD session, and then as they log out for the day, that can be detached from their session, leaving the core Windows 10 image untouched. So it makes it very easy to service that image. You don't have to have multiple images for multiple roles within your organization. You can keep a single image, so it's much easier to maintain and administer throughout your organization. It highly simplifies the overall management of the infrastructure as a whole. Excuse me. So your administrators have to spend a lot less time doing this. That's considered the app attach logic. I don't have that highlighted on this particular slide, but that is another growing component of the WVD world, to be able to bring those types of key features into the user experience to make it highly dynamic and really an awesome experience for the end users across the board. So some of the other key areas to call out are the integration space for WVD. So WVD is completely device independent, so it can run off an HTML5 compatible browser. Of course, it's got iOS, Android, and Windows clients that are highly agile across that board. It's web accessible. It can be driven out of the Office 365 side of the house. I mentioned the FS Logic compatibility. Microsoft's has been and is continuing to develop great monitoring tools and provisioning strategies. The deployment of WVDs now can be done via templates. So being able to provision and expand out WVD pools are extremely easy to do within your organization. So as you get to more prolific times of years, or in the case of COVID, if we were to have a different type of scenario arise that required an increase in WVD type scenarios, or if we could rewind back into the March timeframe, you just needed to allocate a bunch of additional WVD guest OSs. That type of deployment would be very easy to do in WVD, just based on these templatized type of things. The native integration to OneDrive, again, I mentioned a little bit earlier the already pre-configured components into Intune and Azure allows the native allocation of multi-factor authentication for WVD, conditional access, single image. All those things are just right out of the box for WVD. So there's no additional configuration that needs to be done with, like you would have to do with any of the other third-party products that are out there. So I find a slide are some of the key differentiators, and while these are kind of high-level components, they're things that really kind of stand out in the Microsoft space. And granted, some of these are because Microsoft's Microsoft, and we are talking about Windows 10, and we're going to talk Office 365 is in that equation, but VMware and Citrix, while they're hosting their VDI platforms, and even some of them are hosted directly on Azure. So, that does give them at least some closer proximity to like the Office 365, core infrastructure that's there. Microsoft has that key differentiator in that the WVD solution sits directly in their data center. So WVD is the only multi-session Windows 10 virtual desktop experience that's out there. So what does that mean? That means that it's the only one that allows multiple users to connect to a single virtual desktop. So that means that if you have rather than provisioning out 10 different desktops for 10 different users, you've got a single desktop that can be used by multiple users. And those sessions can be exponentially is probably the wrong word. It can be used with multiple different users to be able to keep your costs down across the board, especially for those light users that I mentioned in an earlier slide. So it significantly decreases the virtual machine resource cost across the board. The second piece is that in a matter of virtually speaking, the Office 365 Pro Plus sits on the same data center backbone as what the WVD infrastructure sits on as well. So from just a pure technical perspective, it provides the best performance, but it also has a lot of built-in optimizations for Office 365 Pro Plus that just doesn't exist in any other virtualization platform out there. For companies with RDS, there are native integrations so that you can do direct migrations from your RDS platforms directly over to Azure. And then, excuse me, and then for any of the other platforms that are out there, there are native scripts and automation components that Microsoft makes available through WVD so that you can take those applications. So as I mentioned, the app attach earlier, to be able to transition some of your in-house applications and make those natively available as application attachments into your WVD platform. There's native things that Microsoft makes available, some at no cost, literally the MSIX attach application, no cost to be able to transition some of those applications and make those directly available as part of the transition period to take your virtualization and your on-premise environment around imaging and desktop deployment and transition them into Windows Virtual Desktop. So that's a lot about the technical side. And I know that there's probably a lot of you that are like, okay, so how do we take all this technical mumbo jumbo and turn it into the real world? So what I am going to do now is turn it back over to John and let him talk a little bit more about how that transitions into the real world. And again, thank you all for your time.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about how Windows Virtual Desktop works in the real world and where Insight can help on that cloud journey that's going to get you started and get you moving with Windows Virtual Desktop. So one of the important things is to think about, inside your organization, what scenarios is Windows Virtual Desktop really appropriate for? Where can you start taking advantage of the benefits that are accrued both from a cost perspective and a management perspective from Windows Virtual Desktop? And there's a couple of key places that go a little bit just outside the work from home COVID-19. First off, any organization that has significant security and regulatory burdens or compliance or needs compliance attestation, having that singular management platform, that singular image managing your virtual desktops out of a single location that exists in, a public cloud that already has 90 plus compliance and regulatory attestations tied to it. You can start with auditors when you go through a project like that with, half of those boxes checked off simply by working in a shared services model where the shared services are managed by Microsoft. Another one is an elastic workforce. So if you have, seasonality, whether planned or unplanned, in your organization, your business, not having to provide those users with the standard loadout kit, hey, here's your expensive laptop, here's et cetera, being able to say, here's a Chromebook, here's a device, and all of the desktop and data and profile lives in the cloud, helps onboard those employees faster and can be a tremendous benefit to scaling your workforce up and down. Again, we talked about this a lot, specific employees. This is the remote workforce, right? Branch and remote workers in call centers, workers that have bring your own device and mobile needs. One of the things that we didn't touch on is that Windows Virtual Desktop has applications across platforms. So whether you need to work on a traditional laptop, whether you need to work via a browser, whether you need to work via an Android or iOS device, we can give employees access to corporate applications and data through Windows Virtual Desktops, allowing them to work where and how they would like to work. And finally, specialized workloads. Charlie touched a little bit on, things like CAD, but if you have specialized workloads in your organization and you don't necessarily need that kind of raw horsepower, those machines all the time. Again, tremendous cost savings can be found by pushing those applications and those workloads to the cloud when you need it, using the elasticity provided by Azure, and then downscaling when you don't. And many organizations are already eligible for Windows Virtual Desktop. So I know this is, beyond the nuts and bolts that Charlie talked about. This is another key point. there's two components to the cost of Windows Virtual Desktop, right? On one side, you have the licensing and OS component, operating system component, and on the other side, you have kind of the Azure consumption that is being driven, the compute, the RAM, and the storage. On the operating system side, if you have one of the Microsoft 365 suites that includes Windows 10 Enterprise per user, so this is any of the flavors of E3 or E5, this is Microsoft 365 Business, or even the F1, the M365 F1, which is the frontline worker license, you are already eligible for the operating system requirement here. There's no additional licensing costs, which is obviously what you'd find potentially with competitors like Citrix or VMware. Additionally, if you're looking at modernizing RDS workloads quickly in the cloud, so you're going to use Windows Virtual Desktop to essentially rehost a remote desktop server farm, if you have those RDS CALs with active software assurance, you're already licensed to take advantage of Windows Virtual Desktop at no additional cost. Again, you are still going to pay for the underlying compute, but the nature of the technology where you can have that true multi-session environment and utilize those resources more fully across your base of users and end users means that you can look at a cloud-based desktop as a service with Windows Virtual Desktop at a significantly lower cost than you find with other DaaS providers out there. So how can we help? How can Insight jumpstart your journey into the cloud? How can we help you with your Windows Virtual Desktop implementation? But we have a number of Windows Virtual Desktop services. We have our WVD Jumpstart, which I'm going to talk to you here in depth, which is a rapid deployment that can get you up and running quickly. We have our WVD Health Check, which if you are already using Windows Virtual Desktop and you're not certain that you're optimized necessarily, you had to get it stood up quickly. You stood it up in March because it was you had to get employees working from home remotely, and now you want to go take a look at it. We have key services around making sure that that platform is being utilized correctly and can grow and scale with your organization as you continue to take advantage of it. And then standard consulting services. If you have custom WVD problems or you need custom deployments, we can help you out with that. I want to touch briefly on our jump starts and talk about the methodology with which these are designed. So Insight offers a number of jump starts. We're obviously talking about Windows Virtual Desktop for the purposes of this webinar, but we also have ones around Azure Infrastructure as a Service, Azure Platform as a Service, even things like Windows Autopilot and Microsoft Intune. And they're designed to be concise and expertly designed engagements that combine knowledge transfer with practical implementation for your organizations. So what we do is we go through kind of a three-stage process. First, we give you the tools to understand and be capable of operationalizing the technology. So we do a workshop with you and your team to help understand the technology, best practices, lessons learned. We do a roadmap development where we talk about how this is going to look inside your environment and what considerations your organization needs to take into consideration to be successful. And finally, we provide you with a built-to best security practices deployment of the technology that you can grow against, a secure foundation with which to expand your cloud footprint. And the reason that we do this is we want to make sure that your teams are not left saying, hey, I wish I had known 6 months ago about what I know now about Windows Virtual Desktop. I would have done so-and-so differently. I've accrued X, Y, and Z technical debt. Utilizing our Jumpstart approach, we can get you rapid deployments of key cloud technologies built to best practices that your organization can expand on, knowing that they are built securely, knowing that they are built to spec, and knowing that your teams have the capabilities to take them over and operationalize them. And for our Windows Virtual Desktop Jumpstart, we're going to walk you through a WV deployment and best practices. We're going to talk about your WVD roadmap and implementation. And then we're going to remotely deploy a WVD environment, a golden image for you, including Office 365 applications. And we're going to deploy Windows Virtual Desktop for 5 users. And right now, because of the demands placed on organizations because of COVID-19, within this Jumpstart, we're actually going to deploy up to 50 users for you. So again, giving you that understanding of how this technology operates, giving you the understanding of how your organization is going to take advantage of it, and then building you that environment with which you can grow against. And this takes, as long as we have organizational buy-in, et cetera, we can get you up and running with those 50 desktops in under a week. So very quickly proving out value of this technology in your organization as it relates to business continuity, as it relates to work from home, as it relates to the global pandemic. So if you're interested in any of these, our Windows Virtual Desktop Jumpstart, our Windows Virtual Desktop Health Check, or any of the consulting services that we have to offer around Windows Virtual Desktop, I urge you to reach out to your account executive, reach out to me. We'd be happy to get on a call and talk about how this could look in your organization and where we can help enable that cloud journey with WVD. With that, I think we've got Charlie, we've got Jeff, we've got other smart people, other than myself on to answer any questions, but I really appreciate everybody's time today and look forward to hearing from you.
All right, thank you, John. So the Q&A window is currently open for questions. I don't see any questions presently in the chat. However, we'll stay online here for just another minute or so. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A chat, and we have John and Charlie on hand here to make sure they get answered. So let us hang out here for just a minute, and if there aren't any questions that pop up, though, and if you offhand and you do think of any questions, please feel free to reach out to us after the webinar. You can reach out to John, Charlie, or myself. My email is blair.loveland@insight.com, and I'll ask John and Charlie to give their emails as well. That way, if you have any questions you think of after the presentation, you've had a chance to digest everything, you can ask them directly as well. Here we have a question here. How do we request an engagement? So John or Charlie, do you want to field that one?
Sure, I'll field that. This is John. So I'm happy to, my email address is john.pontius@insight.com. I would be happy to help you and your organization with any questions, getting you set up with one of our experts, having that conversation. You can also reach out to your Insight AE. Say, hey, I was on this webinar. I'm, interested in learning more about your Windows Virtual Desktop. They're all clued into our own internal request path, and that'll get back to me. So if you're more comfortable working through that manner, or you have other things to discuss with your account executive besides WVD, I urge you to reach out that way. If not, john.pontius, Blair will figure out some way to send that out to all of the participants after the recording, but john.pontius@insight.com, and be happy to get you set up.
Awesome.
We also, I want to say, if you're looking at this and you're saying, hey, I like this a lot, I'm interested, but I would like to learn maybe more about WVD first before I jump into some type of professional services. We also have what we call our envisioning sessions, which are hour-long sessions with one of our Microsoft solutions consultants around specific technologies. We have one for WVD. That'll get you and your group kind of some one-on-one Q&A with our experts to talk through Windows Virtual Desktop, decide if it's right for you. So if you're not quite ready to make the move into Windows Virtual Desktop, but you're interested in knowing more, again, your Insight account executive or myself say, I'm looking for an envisioning session, and we can get you set up. Those are no cost to your organization. Again, they're about an hour with one of our experts. So if you're looking to kick the tires on it a little bit more, we can absolutely help you out with that too.
Awesome. Thank you, John. So I don't see any other questions in the Q&A box. So with that, again, if you have any questions, you know how to reach us. And stay tuned for next month's webinar, which is going to be around Azure Sentinel. Webinar registrations and invites should be going out for that one shortly, so we hope to see you next month as well. This technical series is going to be throughout the rest of the year, so please make sure you keep an eye on your email box for those awesome invites from Mr. Pontius and Mr. Balmer. Aside from that, we hope you have a great rest of the day, and if you happen to be in the path of the coming storm, please stay safe, and we are here for you. So with that, we're going to close today's session, and again, thank you for attending today.